What do you get when you play a country song backwards? Your house, your dog, your wife, your truck. I guess we'll punch it down for a little bit of this episode. There's a very specific image that comes to some people's minds when it comes to country music. Usually of a 30-something good-looking dude leaning against a lifted pickup truck with a domestic beer, singing about his love of jean shorts and his hometown and guns and Jesus. I'm going to guess that some of you not only don't relate to that, but you may find it antithetical to your own beliefs. I think it's perfectly valid not to like something because you don't relate to it. But it is worth noting just how large country as a genre is. It has almost as many subgenres as rock does. And we don't typically lump rock all together, but we do for country for some reason. Let's unpack that. We can roughly trace country music back to the Southeast and Southern Appalachia, where immigrants to those areas would bring their own musical traditions and instruments from home. By the 1910s, these musical traditions evolved into something that roughly resembles country or blues. The advent of the radio in the 1920s would give rise to some of the first country stars, people like Jimmie Rodgers and the Skillet Lickers. This cultural pop would culminate into a big bang in 1927, when a record company by the name of Victor Talking Machine Company funded a slew of recordings in Bristol, Tennessee. These recordings included blues, ragtime, gospel, and string band standards that, when pressed to vinyl, allowed them to proliferate through the radio. As radio became an ever more popular source of entertainment in the 30s and 40s, this so-called cowboy music coming out of the Southeast would end up growing in popularity. Amplifying this trend, musicians like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers would end up becoming Hollywood stars in movies that romanticized the Wild West. Country music would be along for the ride as these Western movies became increasingly popular. Before World War II, this music would be widely known as hillbilly music. The music industry itself would even call it honky tonk music. A honky tonk was considered to be any bar that played country music. And the bars that played this music often developed their own styles of it. Rowdier, more rhythm-centric, often played on beat-down tack pianos. By the late 1940s, this style could be considered a large part of country music proper. I think it's worth noting exactly who was both listening and creating the style of music at the time. Outlaws, those who idealized being ungovernable, and probably had some choice words to the government about prohibition. All of which is still consistent with the attitudes that we hold to old school country music. Fierce independence, autonomy at any cost, and f*** the feds. Honestly, not too different from what we consider to be the idealized punk rocker. In the 50s and 60s, the blues genre would have several inspired children, such as bluegrass, rock and roll, and what we might consider to be the beginnings of what we know as contemporary country. And while Elvis was concerning conservative Americans with just how far a hip could gyrate before it became obscene, artists like Buck Owen, Hank Williams, and Johnny Cash were all further cementing the future legacy of country music. Singing story-driven ballads with minimal instrumentation about what they considered to be the truth about life, love, and God. Johnny Cash would have a prolific influence over country music and even American music in general. A true outlaw, arrested several times for drug possession, public drunkenness, and even killing 49 endangered condors by accident when his truck caught fire. Famously saying to the judge that, "I didn't do it, my truck did, and it's dead, so you can't question it." As he cultivated this outlaw image, he would also tear up the charts with perfect fusions of pop hooks and cowboy charm. And even if you don't like country music in general, I think it's worth checking out Cash's singles at the very least, especially for their cultural influence and their excellent songwriting. The 1960s would also see the British invasion of rock and pop from overseas. Bands like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and the Kinks. Country music would not be immune to this shift in counterculture, as we can probably trace country rock back to these roots, saying that the Byrds or Leonard Skinner are a direct result from this happening. And country would not be immune to external influence through the 70s and 80s as well. Yes, there were traditionalists who fought the change like Merle Haggard and George Strait, but the order of the day was disco, and country would answer the call. Artists like Kenny Rogers, Dolly Parton, and Conway Twitty all found ways to infuse disco elements into their music. Strong downbeats, stronger melodies, synths, and a flair for the dramatic. This is perhaps where we start seeing the transition from pure hillbilly music stereotypes to the beer, boots, and Jesus model that we have today. Then came the 90s, and a man named Garth Brooks, the god of country pop music, the best-selling country artist of all time. The man who may be solely responsible for altering the trajectory of country music from then on. 20 number one hits, 156 million albums sold, more diamond albums than the goddamn Beatles. And has remained culturally relevant enough to sing at Joe Biden's inauguration earlier this year. And yeah, the music at this time was pop-influenced country, but the core of it was still there. Most songs released in this time through the mid-2000s all were still story-driven, telling tales about love, life, and heart-held beliefs. According to country musician Harlan Howard, all you needed were 3 chords and the truth. And at this time, country still held fast to that belief. The style had changed, but the core concept hadn't. And yet people were still disliking country at this time, mostly because it was either unrelatable to them, too formulaic, or because country music as an institution didn't line up with their own core values. And honestly, that's fine. You're a lot less likely to enjoy something if you don't relate to it, if the concepts it presents are alien to you. And let's be honest that the stereotypes about who listened to country also had something to do with it. I will still contend that underneath all of these stereotypes and hang-uppances, there is excellent storytelling and excellent songwriting to be heard. In 2005, Trace Atkins released his album Songs About Me, and the third single off of that album was a song called Honky Tonk Badonka-Donk. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that that was patient zero for what would become bro country. A wave of chauvinism, machismo, and nationalism would overtake country music in the late 2000s and become increasingly popular through the early 2010s. Leading into the stereotypes that precluded country music as uncultured and stuck in its ways, while simultaneously betraying the hollow traditions of good songwriting and an outlaw attitude. Country would really start leaning into things like using drum samples instead of acoustic drums, with snaps on beats 2 and 4 instead of snares, R&B styles of talk singing or even rapping during verses, and less emphasis on storytelling in the lyrics, and more lyrics that lined up with traditional notions of pop or R&B. With breakout crossover hits like Body by a Back Road, that's a totally different song. With breakout hits like
Sam Hunt's
Body Like a Back Road and Meant to Be by Baby Rexha, it's hard to blame the industry for hopping on the trend of merging pop and country to appeal to a wider audience. But it does kind of leave a bad taste in the mouth of country traditionalists. It doesn't exactly leave a sparkling impression on those who are inexperienced with the style of music. This era also has a distinct lack of diversity, with a female artist failing to chart for the first time ever in 2018. The charts instead being dominated by seemingly identical 20 to 30-something-year-old, strong-jawed, frat boy-looking dudes singing about ambiguous good times. I'll be frank with you that pretty much all pop country right now, the mainstream stuff that gets played on the radio, it really does sound all the same to me. Pop and radio rock sung with a southern accent by dudes wearing flannel unironically. The institution that is country music seems to be self-aware about the problem, with these artists all voicing concerns and criticisms about the direction that the genre is heading. With Zac Brown even saying that Luke Bryan's That's My Kind of Night is, quote, the worst song I've ever heard. Like most things in music, we should definitely treat this as a trend. This is all mainstream stuff consumed through traditional sources like radio or television. Never before in human history have we ever had so many avenues to not listen to what's popular, to do our own thing. And that's just what some country artists have chosen to do. With the advent of the internet, we threw off the chains of traditional corporate curation and began to blaze our own paths into the information, connections, and media. With that, music became infinitely more accessible. What was hours spent in a record shop is now seconds of browsing at the end of your wrist. Music production has become so cheap that almost anyone can do it. Professional sounding recordings can now be recorded, mixed, and released for less than $1,500. This being opposed to the tens of thousands it would have been not even 20 years ago. This not only gives consumers options, but also gives creators almost infinite reach. Like if you were trying to make a country rap crossover track laid over top of a Nine Inch Nails backing track back in the early 2000s, not much is going to come from that. But today we would still be debating about whether or not your song belonged on the country charts, or if you were a true country artist. And that's the beauty of it. There's an ocean of music out there, and I'm just personally sad that I'm not going to get a chance to hear it all. It's just gone underground, being recorded by some small artist in some small town, just waiting for you to discover them. Country music exploded into many, many different subgenres over its lifetime. Outlaw, Western, Rockabilly, which is really something I need to do its own episode on. Neo-traditional, Bluegrass, all of which have active scenes of their own, especially in online spaces. If you really hate bro country, you could really consider it to be the slag that comes from the smelting process. Deep inside the kiln, still stirring up heat, is the vibrant core that is country music. Arguably, it's never been more alive. And odds are, I bet you that there's something that you're going to like. And those scenes have spilled back into the mainstream in weird places as well. I've already mentioned Old Town Road, but we could go back as far as Taylor Swift. Her merging of pop and country so seamlessly that she seems able to float between genres and even cultures at will. The resurgence of Miley Cyrus in what appears to be her disco country phase. The amazing bluegrass and country-inspired soundtrack to the game Kentucky Route Zero. I'll never forget doing sound for a punk show in a co-op basement, and one of the hosts asking me to play High Horse by Casey Musgraves after one of the sets, and everyone at the venue loving it. Today's counterculture in general seems to view the traditional roots of country music favorably. I've already seen people younger than myself adopting country tropes and mannerisms ironically. And joking about something is sometimes the first step in accepting something into your identity. In the same way, disco has recently found a resurgence after we got over our cultural hang-ups about it. There may be a place for country in the mainstream again. Sometime soon, even. We may be able to even look past the tropes at this point and see it for what it is. Whether that's Dolly Parton trying to break the glass ceiling with 9 to 5, or Carrie Underwood's empowering, if maybe a little problematic, before he cheats. Or even realizing that country at its roots is deeply in favor of the working class. There's a lot to like underneath the thin veneer of boots, babes, and pickup trucks. So will mainstream country ever return to its roots of my surroundings and my upbringing led me down an irreversible path of bad decisions, I lost my wife and it's my fault, and also f*** the feds? Well, probably not, given how deeply ingrained problematic notions of machismo and patriotism, or nationalism, depending on who you ask, is ingrained in the culture. But seeing deep storytelling and good musicianship return to it, I think that's a fair ask. I listened to country music almost exclusively until I was 14. It brings back nostalgic memories of me spending time with my grandfather over the summers. Waking up at 6 a.m., grabbing rod and reel, and going off to God knows where to fish into the late evening. So yeah, I might be a little bit biased, but I understand that country isn't for everyone, and that's okay. However, stereotypes and cultural hang-ups about a genre of music shouldn't be the reason why we don't listen to that genre of music. And I can't shake the feeling that some of this derision is based off of an element of classism as well. And yes, there are definitely problematic elements to this music in areas. The glorification and romanticization of colonialism, its potential as propaganda for nationalism, looking at you, Toby Keith, and the rampant chauvinism that its current iteration harbors. All inexcusable, all need to be addressed, and all need to be considered when consuming this type of media. Some of the distaste is justified as well. Some artists in certain subgenres definitely seem inauthentic, like they're pandering, like all they're trying to do is cast the widest net to get the most audience and the most money, alienating both core fans and those inexperienced with the genre. That's not good. We've seen it happen with other genres of music as well. Cough, post-grunge, uncough. Until it stops selling, it's going to stick around. But at least we have options. Whole avenues to explore and satiate our sonic palette. Tight-knit communities to discuss our tastes with. We're not limited to the cartel of popular taste anymore. So go out and explore new auditory possibilities. Steel guitars, banjos, mandolins, fiddles, men crooning about how they lost their wives and hate their boss. Find the ye to your haw. And that'll do it for me today. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell if you want to get notified next time we upload.